Welcome. My name is Shuvaloy Majumdar, and I'm at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Center for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad. I'm ecstatic today to be joined by three brilliant minds when it comes to the larger questions about the world's strategic competition with China. I should confess that what precipitated this entire idea of hosting a web conference, a discussion, was a paper authored by Nadège Rolland, who brilliantly defined and published in January the concept of the China model and what China's aspirations are, particularly under the Communist Party and President Xi Jinping, in shaping the world order to come. It's about a 60-page, 70-page dissertation that brilliantly examines Chinese literature, scholarship, and I commend you all to take a few minutes to read it. Even if you can't get past the executive summary, it will be well worth your while to help shape some of the context in what you're seeing in the world today. I'm also joined by a couple of very distinguished colleagues of mine at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. The first is Charles Burton, who has notoriety in Canada and around the world for his immense expertise as a former diplomat in China on the politics of China, on the human rights situation there. And even more recently, I think around the world, many of you would have already seen that open letter co-published between the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the Henry Jackson Society, and European Values. Much of that is a great credit to my colleague Charles Burton for rallying over 200 experts to the cause of explaining to the world and to the Chinese people our sense of solidarity with them. And finally, but certainly not least, my partner in developing all of the foreign policy work at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Dr. Jonathan Berkshire Miller, is not just a great talent for advocating Canadian interests in the Indo-Pacific region. He has many hats, including in Tokyo with the Japanese Institute for International Affairs. He is one of the deepest thinkers about Japan's place in the Indo-Pacific region, and from that perspective has so much to contribute on the discussion around China's rise. Enough of me. I'm not planning on making much more commentary beyond that. I get to host a conversation between three amazing friends, and I hope that you really enjoy the dialogue and the debate and the discussion that follows. So to kick it off, let me begin by turning to Nadège to give us a bit of a flavor as to what you described, Nadège, in the China model, in what you see happening out of President Xi Jinping's Communist Party and China. And perhaps, often the conversation starts in the middle. May I suggest it start more at the beginning in the context of where of how we've arrived here from Deng Xiaoping reforms through to the contemporary era of the Communist Party's conception of China's place in the world.
Yeah, we can even start earlier with Mao, the turning
By all means.
The turning point with Deng Xiaoping was to abandon the revolutionary ideas and to focus more on China's internal economic development and self-strengthening in a way, with economic reforms and a mix of Marxist-Leninism, but also some capitalism on top of that. Where we are now under Xi Jinping, it's a new turning point, but it's also a sort of continuation or acceleration of trends that have happened before, where thanks to the strengthening and the growing of China's material capacities, of its hard power, of its economic clout, of its diplomatic importance, of its military importance in the world, the Chinese leadership now under Xi Jinping feels like their time has come to say more clearly, more transparently, if I can say so, that they want their place under the sun, and they also want to assert their worldview that is very different from the one that the current international order has. So, of course, here we're talking about a one-party state, a Chinese Communist Party that's authoritarian in nature, and the worldview of these Chinese political elites, supported by the Chinese intellectual elites, is very different from someone who is sitting in Washington D.C. And the values and the norms that we're thinking about as supporting a general order for the world are very different from Beijing's perspective. So here we are at this juncture where there are internal discussions about what the world under Beijing's helm would look like. Of course, China has not risen fully yet. Even Xi Jinping thinks that it will take until the mid-century, perhaps, to completely rejuvenate the Chinese nation. But they're preparing slowly and starting to at least think about what is it that they would want. And the topic of my report was, what is this vision? Even if it's not fully formed yet, even if it's not fully emerged yet in reality, what are the big trends or the big ideas that underpin this vision? So it's very difficult to explain because you have many strands of ideas. It's very abstract, but at the same time, you can see some themes emerging, some themes growing up to the surface, and we can talk about that. We're in a different space for China today. We're in a different juncture. The Chinese leadership calls that a new era, and this is the opening of this new era. And now they're trying to project the meaning for what it means for China as a great power in the world.
Nadège, I really appreciate that brilliant overview. So let me ask you a quick follow-up question, which is, I do want you to describe a little bit more today about how you see China pushing back against a system that they seek to explicitly replace. Give us a survey of what your findings were in the kind of efforts that they've been making.
Right. So, as you know, the People's Republic of China has fully integrated the international order, starting in the 1970s, and has gained a seat at the UN Security Council, has integrated multilateral institutions, and the hope back then was that China, thanks to being integrated into this international system and its institutions, would be socialized and would integrate and would follow the rules and would ending up liking the rules and committing to them. And what we see now is that as it has grown powerful in all material dimensions, Chinese leadership is not so keen in supporting those rules and norms. Why? Because the basis for the current international order is freedom. You know, we call that the liberal international order. It means free. It's based on the idea of the freedom of the individual, on the respect of the sanctity of the freedom of the individual, and everything else falls from that very simple but very deep idea. You can have freedom of expression, of trade, of choosing your own government, of being informed, etc., etc. And that's really the basis for all the norms and rules of this current international liberal rule-based order. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't believe in the sanctity of the individual freedom. Not only that, but it also thinks that this is an idea that's very dangerous for its own domestic rule. And it used to be the case that the CCP was very defensive and didn't want those ideas, liberal ideas, democratic ideas, to subvert the Chinese population, because they thought this is dangerous for their own legitimacy and for the sustainability of their own rule internally. But as their power has grown, I think now there's a sense that they also need to shape and reform, going beyond their own domestic territory, but also shaping the institutions and the norms that those institutions internationally are supporting. So this is the next step that we're trying to see, and this is at the essence of what they're trying to do.
Right. Those are very powerful ideas you just touched upon. Thank you so much for that, especially in seeing that seismic shift of how China is now beginning to move from, I suppose, a position of strategic patience to seizing a strategic advantage. Charles, let me turn to you now on your kind of reaction to Nadège's initial commentary here, but principally also around the idea of what China's destabilization in its near neighborhood, whether it's in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea, some of the more geopolitical and military expressions of that. I'd be curious to see what your thoughts are.
Well, I think that Nadège's paper does go into this to a large extent. And, the idea that the government of China opposes the notion of a world of equal autonomous citizens is clear. And how China seeks to debase this idea and bring about this community of the common destiny of mankind, as they put it, is by gradually debasing the global multilateral institutions and attempting to oppose liberal democratizing forces in the nations of the world. So, the most recent and most egregious example, perhaps, has been China's coming onto the United Nations Human Rights Council, where they will have evidently the authority to determine who will be as special rapporteur and who won't, to try and essentially, I think, got that instrument of the UN to promote these ideas of liberal democracy that are so central to the ideology underlying global institutions. So, you do see that the notion that there is a systematic plan to try and bring the existing global institutions like the WTO and the UN into increasing irrelevance, because China feels that these institutions support a global community that's dominated by the United States and its allies, and to replace that with new institutions that, as Nadège has talked about in this paper and in a lot of her previous work, is underlain by the power and economic scheme of the Belt and Road Initiative to try and reorient the entire planet towards Beijing in terms of trade, so that China can resume what's regarded, in an interpretation of history, its traditional role as the dominant civilization on the planet, a transnational antithesis to barbarism, where the further you go from the capital of China, the more barbaric you are, to a new kind of world where the equality of the nation state will be debased into this kind of notion of a moral rule led by China, which would not include democracy, which China sees as inimical to its overall global agenda. So, we see this occurring in China's domination of economic activity in countries round about, but also extending equally throughout the planet, particularly in all of the areas that could be touched upon by the Belt and Road, which would include Northern Africa and Europe and the Middle East. Maybe Canada and the United States are considered well over into the periphery and aren't a direct cause for concern for China, but certainly, as we know from a number of things that the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has put out, China's attempt to influence our own Canadian democracy and society, and to try and debase our democratic institutions by co-opting key policymakers and using business influence to try and and influence our democratic decision-making process is pretty well documented. So, from that point of view, I think that China does have a scheme. And I think perhaps I'm a bit more cynical about it than Nadège in the sense of whether there's a master plan or not. I'm inclined to think that the Chinese Communist Party at the top levels has a lot more in terms of planning and notion of how this would play out in future, or at least how they hope it would play out in future than Nadège's paper suggests. But I think she's a person who has perhaps more confidence in the goodness of humanity than I have at this time.
Well, I'm going to let Nadège respond to that in just a moment. But before she does, I would like to ask you, Charles, when you look at what's been happening inside China and President Xi's own control, you've seen a tightening around the dictatorship rather than a relaxing around issues of free speech or association, the values that Nadège had mentioned in her opening. What do you think is happening there, looking from the outside into the fishbowl? Do you think that this is a government that in the context of COVID is increasingly paranoid or confident?
Well, I think certainly it's paranoid. I mean, if China felt that their ideology could stand up, and in fact that their political and social institutions are best suited to the Chinese people because of cultural and historical characteristics, then they would allow them to contend in a free marketplace of ideas. But the Chinese government instead has to engage in extreme measures to suppress debate, to prevent information from entering China from abroad, and engaging in ruthless measures to address dissent. So I think as the Xi government has become more assertive in opposing the idea of liberal values, it's become more and more necessary to try and impose and strengthen ideological work and censorship of all forms of media. And there's more and more use of artificial intelligence and surveillance technology to achieve that. Previously under his predecessors like Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, there was a promise that when conditions were right, when economic, historical, and political conditions would allow, that China would move to political reform and liberalization. I mean, after all, the government of China signed the United Nations International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights in 1998, and the expectation is that they'd be moving to ratification. But that is completely over. And so any hope that liberal intellectuals in China might have had, or that people in China might have felt that China would, in fact, enter into the community of nations of equal autonomous citizens, has been scotched by Xi's reimposition of the Stalinist norms that informed the regime from the beginning. So, yes, I think it is becoming more repressive and probably will continue to have to be more repressive. And certainly we don't know the extent to which the COVID-19 crisis is weakening the authority of the regime. But, traditionally in China, when things go wrong in the natural world, the political authorities are seen as responsible. So I think there's a cultural proclivity to blame earthquakes and famine on the inadequacies of their political leaders, and whether that's going to play out once the COVID crisis is past remains to be seen.
No, thank you for that. What do you think, Nadège? Is Charles being overly cynical, or do you think it's more of a haphazard situation in China on the policies that they've been able to arrive at?
No, I don't think Charles is cynical at all. I think he's very knowledgeable of the history and the evolution of the CCP much more than I am, and I respect his judgment. I agree with you, Charles, that what we're going to see or what we're starting to see actually with this crisis, is a sense of paranoia. I mean, it's always a mix. It's very interesting. I find it's a mix of hubris and utter fear all the time playing together. So there's this self-confidence in China's path or China's achievements. At some point, I don't know whether I can judge whether the Chinese leadership believes its own assessment of itself, or are they cynical themselves? It's very difficult for me to know whether they really believe their own propaganda or whether they're more cynical about it, and what they're trying to project is actually the opposite of what they feel deep inside. You see what I mean?
Absolutely.
In their projection of their own achievements and their own successes, you can see that they certainly feel very confident and bombastic and chest thumping all the time. Is that a revelation of something that's for real, or is that a way for them to hide the reality of their anxieties about all these problems that are coming up? I mean, the economic situation is going to be terrible for our own societies, certainly, but for China as well. And how is that going to put more pressure internally on the leadership? Are we going to see more social unrest, more popular discontent? Probably so. But then the machinery that Charles has described of this heavy-handed internal repression supported by a surveillance state that's becoming more and more technologically efficient might add to the acceleration of the internal repression as well, so that people are unhappy against the regime, but they can't say so. And so it's going to, create more tensions also internally. I think there's also a possibility that because of that growing internal pressure, we shouldn't preclude or dismiss the possibility of China being even more aggressive externally, to try to let some steam out of the inside as well. China is continuing. It's not like this crisis has diverted their interests or their focus on their strategic interests. And maybe Jonathan can say more about that. But in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, China is pushing, and the South China Sea, bullying still, and this has not stopped. This crisis has not stopped that kind of behavior, and it's possible that they're going to maybe push more in that direction in the months to come as things become more difficult at home.
I would say one thing, as an indicator of what Nadège is saying, does the leadership really believe their own propaganda? The fact that the senior leaders, Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping, have sent their children to be educated in universities in the United States, I think is an indicator that they feel that this is where the better education and better worldview is being projected. Otherwise, why wouldn't they educate them at prestigious institutions in China?
There is always that hypocrisy. I want to pick up on this point that both Charles and Nadège have made, Jonathan, and turn to you now on exactly that comment about China's aggression. I think it's stunning, and you're going to know far better than I, Jonathan, what China has been doing recently, even during and in the midst of the pandemic. And so, Jonathan, could you start by giving us a bit of a survey on what China has done in the near neighborhood in the Taiwan Straits, almost on a military level, which seems to be, to me, it seems to be in an alternate universe around the actual spirit of cooperation that's necessary to confront the global pandemic. What are you seeing?
Well, thanks. It seems, geopolitics does not rest during a crisis. And I think that, as Nadège rightly pointed out, there's two ways to kind of think about this. And I've been kind of pondering this a bit myself. Has the pandemic itself accelerated some of China's tactics in the region or altered some of its strategy whether it's vis-a-vis the South China Sea or vis-a-vis Taiwan, or whether is this the same strategy that China's been maintaining, and this is more of a tactical kind of fine-tunement. I kind of am coming down recently more on the latter. So I don't think that their strategy necessarily has changed in some of these domains, but we have seen a very significant uptick in tensions in a lot of these areas. So just to give you, a bit of a sampling of this, I think often now we can be forgiven sometimes, but in this 24/7 news cycle, especially with everything happening with the pandemic, our capacity to take in some of these different flashpoints is limited, but they're all happening at the same time. So if I think of just even with the last week, for example, one area that doesn't get much attention, we hear lots about the South China Sea, but I like to remind people, and this is not just because I house myself in Tokyo for usually half the year, but in the East China Sea surrounding Japan's Senkaku Islands, this situation continues to be an everyday concern. Just earlier this week, we had 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships intruding into Japanese waters there. That's resulted in a démarche from Japan's foreign minister. You throw that in the East China Sea on top of some of the things that we've seen happen recently in the South China Sea, sinking of a Vietnamese vessel. We've seen China continuing to fish off Indonesian waters in the Natunas, in addition to some unprecedented moves in the Taiwan Strait. So I think that it's important for us to remember that it's not that China goes from one to the other and decides to escalate a bit in the South China Sea while easing up in the East China Sea. And we need to have the capacity to respond to each and every one of those. One last point that I think that we would be remiss not to talk about when we're talking about China is the situation on the Korean Peninsula. So just this week, we saw another report from the UN Security Council panel of experts on North Korea. And again, effectively, that's shown what a lot of us who follow the North Korean situation have already known, is that North Korea continues to violate sanctions. Certain member states who shall not be named have been essentially helping them in that circumvention of sanctions. So we need to keep our eye on the ball on all of these regional crises. At the same time, it's a challenging thing, but it's the reality of the new normal with China.
So that's interesting you say it that way, Jonathan, that it's the reality of the new normal, because, what you've described here in maybe some casual observer's eyes would seem like a ratcheting up. Is this in line with longstanding Chinese policy when it comes to disruption in the near neighborhood? Or is this something new? Is it more aggressive? From your vantage point, is this predictable, or is it becoming increasingly unpredictable?
Well, I think it depends on the kind of the flashpoint area. So I think Taiwan would be different than the South China Sea, as would be different from the dispute with Japan. But I do think that China is entering a new stage. So I think, for example, in the South China Sea, China has spent the past few years really aggressively island building, militarizing those islands. And now I think, and we've seen this by the most recent move to effectively try to add governance to some of these islands that are not recognized. It's a new stage in, I think, China's approach. So it's not the same as necessarily dredging sand, but it's still as destabilizing. It's about effectively changing the status quo. I think with Japan, the situation in the East China Sea is a little bit different, because I think China realizes that it's not facing off against the Philippines Navy or even the Vietnamese, but effective Japanese Air Force with a U.S. treaty ally backed up. So I think China is much more cautious and careful in how it deals there. So, I do think this is a long-term strategy for China in a lot of these crises, but I think it fine-tunes its actions depending on the states in the region.
Thanks, Jonathan. Nadège, I'm going to turn to you because I think Jonathan's made some really important insights here about how this is part of the long-term approach for China. When we look at kind of the Chinese vantage point, in your paper, you described concepts of limited hegemony, of discourse power. So for our audience here, and in response to what Jonathan has said, could you give us a description, perhaps paint us a portrait of what the world would look like under the ideal conception of the Chinese model of the China order?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So I would start by saying it would be very different from the American Pax Americana, for example. I think it would rely probably less on military power projection and military intervention. I think the view that's underlying this vision for a China-led world order is live and let live. Basically everybody just does whatever they want as long as they respect China's interests, and that there's a sort of deference towards China's preferences. Because in that system, it's a hierarchical system, and China is at the top of it because it's the biggest and most powerful of them all. And so all the other countries are smaller and weaker in comparison with China. And that way, there is a limit to what other countries can do. The way that Charles described earlier the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, it gives us a sort of a sample of what this could mean. If you have all your trade and IT network connections going to and from China, being basically completely dependable on China's goodwill, it gives China an enormous leverage over those networks and those trade supply chains that China has already tried to use as coercion to get some decisions that are favorable to itself. We have seen economic sanctions or embargoes from China on South Korea, for example, when Seoul decided to have a THAAD system in its territory. There has been some examples of those economic sanctions or use of economic leverage against specific countries in order to achieve a strategic or political aim that is favorable to China's choice or favorable to China. There's been examples of, for example, the deliverance of Chinese tourist visas for Chinese tourists to go to certain South Pacific islands. And then Beijing decided to put them on hold because they wanted this island to shift their support to Beijing instead of Taiwan, or so it's a different way of managing international relations. I think it's the power of the more powerful. It's the power of the bully at the same time. And it's not based on, common values or moral principles as much as it is based on just sheer power.
Right.
So I think that's really the basis for that kind of order. And I think it would be very, very disruptive because the lack of common acknowledgement of common rules, I think what makes the current international order so stable is that there's at least a minimum of agreement about things that can be done and cannot be done. And there's a corpus of law, of international law, to regulate the state behaviors. And I think a China-led order, as long as the CCP is still in power, it will be very, very different rules of the game. And China would not intervene in countries that are killing their own population on the basis of morality. I don't think so. They would just let them
right.
have their population killed. So I think it's that's the kind of world that we're seeing.
It's a very dystopian one, Nadège, that you've described, and the way in which I think you've described the way in which China is seeking to build a new economic system is particularly interesting. Jonathan, when you're looking at the wider Indo-Pacific region, what do you think is happening in the realm of cooperation, whether it's security cooperation or economic cooperation? Is the alliance building accelerating, or has it been diminished as a result of the global lockdown? From your perspective, what's going on in response to the kind of weaponized commerce that Nadège had just so beautifully articulated?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a great point that Nadège made. And I think that what is necessary, and you're seeing this a little bit happen in the United States, you're seeing this happen in Japan, you're seeing this happen in Australia, slowly you're seeing this happen in Canada, is that you're realizing that the need for the engagement in the Indo-Pacific has a paradigm shift. So previously, when it would be how to counter China or how to look at ways to mitigate some of the negative elements of the Chinese regime in the region, it would be focused on the U.S. alliance network, and particularly in a defense dynamic. That is still absolutely important. U.S. alliances being bolstered, whether they're the treaty alliances. The U.S. has 5 treaty alliances in the region, and some of the strategic partnerships, which I think sometimes are not discussed as much as the treaty alliances, but can be just as important. And one of those that I would point to, I don't have the time to get into it much right now, but it's the India relationship. So the U.S.-India security relationship, I think, is very important, even though it's not at a treaty ally level. But that being said, I think one of the challenges, and this is unique to the U.S.-China relationship, is that this won't be like the old Cold War. This is not something that you can just pour billions and billions of defense budgets in and expect to be able to counter China's rise. This is much more multi-pronged, and this requires a new menu of engagement options. And I think, as you know, I want to kind of bring this into Canada a little bit, because countries like Canada, we're often asked, Shuv and Charles, how can Canada manage China in the region? How can Canada contribute? How could it develop an Asia or Indo-Pacific strategy? And I think the question is very important, because we do have a critical role. And I think that the idea of minilateral cooperation, so working together with India, working together with the Japans, the Australias, countries in ASEAN, I think is going to be critically important. In Asia, there is no such thing as a NATO. There's no multilateral treaty organization in security terms. So it's a patchwork, a spaghetti bowl of different alignments and alliances. There needs to be much more minilateral cooperation. And I think on the second element, if you think on the kind of the economic side, I think we are seeing some positive developments on this. The U.S., Japan, and Australia now have a trilateral infrastructure investment fund that it won't be able to counter BRI, but it's one element that I think is very important. Another, just a final point, and one kind of organization I think gets overlooked, but is crucially important in this, is the ADB, so the Asian Development Bank based in Manila. I think there's been a lot of hype and a lot of discussion about the AIIB, but I think the ADB still continues to disperse billions in the region and has more leadership backing from the US and Japan and others. So we need to rely on the ADB as well to be working with states in the region to provide sustainable, transparent infrastructure investment.
I thank you for those recommendations, Jonathan. Those are all excellent. In fact, I'm going to, as we round out this conversation, turn to Charles and then Nadège for final comments. But I'd love to end it on exactly that point, is that in the face of this rising China model, and Jonathan, I'm grateful you said it, there still remains a lot of myopia about what China truly is and what its ambition is in the world. And I'm hoping this conversation is useful to a wider audience in understanding that what China is looking to do is to replace the international order, not just inform it. And so, Charles, looking at this China model, what do you see beyond, the cooperation in how we can mitigate it on the economy or in the military that Jonathan got into? What about the cooperation on the basis of our shared values, and with countries that might share it? Would you be able to lend some insight as to how you think the democratic community of countries around the world, the democratic world, can respond to the proposition of the China model?
Well, I think that, picking up on some of what Nadège said, a lot of what China wants is deference from the world. They still have this historiography of humiliation in the Opium War, and they'd like a return to the kind of tributary system where the lesser powers acknowledge China's greatness, civilizational greatness, the greatness of the Confucian tradition, which was important in Japan and Vietnam and Korea, use of Chinese characters and so on. And so what you see more recently has been the Chinese government's insistence that senior members of government be present on the tarmac when the Chinese aid has been delivered to places like the Czech Republic and Lithuania, and to listen to a speech by the Chinese ambassador and just stand there, paying tribute to China's beneficence and civilizational greatness. So, from that point of view, it goes against our ideas of fairness and reciprocity. And so I do think that it's important that we raise awareness among people, and therefore pressuring governments, that our agreements with China should be based on fairness and reciprocity and shouldn't be based on conditionality, which goes against our own interests. So, the idea that Canada would adopt the Huawei 5G, for example, because if we don't, we would suffer great economic consequences as we incur the ire of the regime, is not something that we ought to give into. And there are two aspects here. For one thing, our external trade to China is only about 4 point something now, particularly with the recent Chinese non-tariff barriers against agricultural commodity exports into China, as opposed to 78% to the United States. So the mythology that Canada would suffer enormously if we don't collaborate with China's vision of how our relations should be guided, which is, in other words, on the asymmetrical terms of China, is not well-founded. So I think that we have to make it in a kind of coordinated way, make it clear to China that they must respect the norms of the WTO and the norms of the international rules-based order, or we simply cannot deal with them. In other words, if that means that we have to readjust our economic trade and reorient ourselves, say, more towards the TPP, then it's a cost that we have to bear, because the cost of collaborating in China's overall global scheme would be disastrous for a middle power like Canada that's so dependent on the existing global structures which allow for the equality of nations in international multilateral institutions. So, I think awareness is important, and maybe that's an important role that MLI has to play, and that Nadege's report also plays in terms of making people be aware of what China has in mind, which is an underhanded sort of scheme, and to simply not collaborate with it any further.
So on this point, Nadège, I've got a couple of questions before we finish it up. First of all, you're based at the National Bureau of Research, National Bureau of Asian Research in Washington, D.C. You're in the seat of power where you see Congress and this administration take on the question of China over the course of its President Trump's tenure in office. What's your vantage point on where Washington is going to go beyond the pandemic crisis today?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I think it's going to be like, there's two ways that this crisis can go in general. It's either going to completely change the world and the way we're doing things, or it's going to basically accelerate prior trends. And I think in the case of the Trump administration, what's going on now is just going to accelerate those trends. Meaning what exactly? Meaning the Trump administration has been increasingly suspicious of China's ambitions and aspirations, and they have tried more or less clumsily to address this in the economic realm with the so-called trade war and the tariff decisions. But I think things will not necessarily come from the Trump administration itself, but also from the business world and from other agencies and entities that have realized the enormous dependence that our societies have in general on China regarding supply chains, regarding medication, regarding food, etc., etc. And I think there are many businesses that are asking the questions of how can we maybe re-knit those supply chains a little bit differently so that our security is preserved in the future. Because I think this has been a huge wake-up call, not only in the US, but I'm French, so in Europe as well, that this huge dependence on China might not be a good idea. And you cannot just put all your eggs in the same basket. You cannot just, go with China for everything, with your economy, with your business, with your trade. You need to find ways to mitigate the risks that this poses. And that's not to say anything about the political side, which I agree with Charles. I think each country really needs to see what their own interests are. First and foremost, be very clear about, is that your real interest, and not, is Beijing going to be upset or is Beijing going to be angry? Because down the line, I think as much as, if you put your national interests first, the answer will always be the best answer instead of putting another country's interest first or another country's emotions first.
Right.
So it might seem very costly at the beginning, but down the line, it's probably even more costly in the future to act this way, because we know that bullies, the softer you are with them, the more bullying they're going to be. So the demands are going to become higher and higher and inaccessible and unacceptable in the long run. So we need to start putting some stops at really early on. And I think I agree with the tone of this discussion. I think none of this conversation can, or at least planning, can start if we are not aware of what's going on exactly, and go beyond the smoke screen and go beyond this, massive influence that China has been building within our society, within our intellectual and political elites, and have a real fact check of what's going on before we can make informed decisions for our countries. And the coalition of democracies, I think, is a very, very important point. China wants us to be divided so that we don't have the capacity to respond together, so that we're divided, that we're arguing against each other. And this is playing right in Beijing's hands. We have to be more cooperating among each other. We have this long history of trust because we respect the same values, we respect the same rules, and we know that among democracies, we're not going to encounter the problems that we are going to with an authoritarian, aggressive power that has enormous material capacities. So I think at the end of the day, I think the choice is quite blatantly clear, and it might come with some cost. I'm not saying this is not going to be difficult, because we are so much intertwined. But at the same time, as Charles said, I think we need to have a good assessment of how dependent are we exactly, and isn't there other ways, other options that we can at least start to discuss to see whether our interests can be better preserved.
I can't think of a finer wake-up call to conclude this conversation on than what Nadège Rolland had just articulated for us in terms of needing to rethink our relationships with China and to rethink our dependence on democracies amongst each other. Nadège Rolland, thank you so much for such a powerful paper. Again, I know that we'll be promoting it in Canada and around the world with our networks. Charles Burton, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, great colleagues, fantastic minds. We're just so happy in Ottawa to have partners with people like Nadège at the National Bureau. So thank you very much for all of your time today. I hope the viewers today find it interesting. And let me suggest that this is the first of many more conversations to come, a dialogue that is ongoing, and I'm grateful for all of your time. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day and stay safe.